Let's go ahead and get started with step one of our game project. And what we're going to do in this step is we're going to be learning how to draw an image to the screen. So the first thing we want to do is we want to look at the default code that the editor gives us when we create a new program. So you will probably notice here that we have a couple of lines of code that say this word function here. So let's talk about what a function is. A function is a reusable named group or block of code statements that perform some task and make the program actually do something. Okay, so we have two functions here. The first one is called the setup function. Okay, so the setup function is a function that runs once at the start of the program. Then we also have this draw function here. Now the draw function, it runs continuously throughout the program. And on most computers, it runs about 60 times per second. So when we have functions, we also have these curly braces here. So these curly braces are what determines the body of the function. So everything between these curly braces for the setup function is part of the setup function and will run whenever the setup function runs. Okay? So inside of the setup function, we have a command to another built-in function called create canvas. All right? So you notice that create canvas has a set of parentheses after it. Now setup has a set of parentheses also, but they're empty. So in between these parentheses are optional pieces of information that we can pass to a function, and these pieces of information are called arguments or parameters. All right, so sometimes we need this extra information in order for the function to do its job. Okay, so the setup function doesn't have any arguments, so the parentheses are empty. The draw function also doesn't have any arguments. The create canvas function, which is a function that's already built in that we're calling, we are passing it two arguments. The first argument is the number 400, and the second argument is the number 400. So the create canvas function creates the play screen or area that our game will appear in. So everything under this on the right hand side of the screen where we say preview, we see this preview. This is where our canvas or play area will appear. And the two numbers that we're passing it are the width, so how wide the play screen will be, and the height, so how tall the play screen will be. So it's very important to remember that when you pass arguments into a function, they have to be in a specific order. So even though the two numbers 400 and 400 are the same here, you want to make sure that you're always passing the width first and the height second for this function. Okay, so that's our call to our create canvas function that P5JS provides for us. Okay, and that's all inside of the body of our setup function. Now inside of the draw function, we're calling another function called background. Okay, so this command to the background, and we're passing in another argument here, a number 220. So what the call to background does is it draws a colored background for our play screen. And the number that we're passing in represents the color that we want. So let's go ahead and run this. And you'll see that it draws out a colored background. All right, so you can try experimenting with different numbers for the background. It's from about 0 to about 220 or so. And you'll see that it gives you a different color depending on the number that you pass in. But we're going to go ahead and leave it at 220 for our purposes. Okay, so we know what functions are. We have our function, our setup function, and our draw function, and our function body for both of the setup and the draw function. And inside the function bodies for the two, we are calling two other functions that have already been created for us by P5JS. So we don't when we call a function that's already been created, we don't actually need to write function again. Okay, so we know what the default code does now. So let's start talking about how we can add some code to draw an image to the screen. So first of all, before we go ahead and start drawing our image to the screen, there's one thing we need to talk about, and we need to talk about something called coordinate systems. All right. So on a computer screen, we use an X and Y coordinate to represent an object's position or location on the screen. So you can see here in this diagram here where it says we have a colored grid, and the one that says computer, that represents a computer screen. Okay. Now you see we have a dot here at the upper left hand corner of this graph or grid that represents the computer screen. So the x-axis, you see this word x here with an arrow, the x-axis, which is the horizontal part of the graph, is represents how far to the left or right an object is on the screen. Okay, the y-axis is how far up or down on the screen an object is. Okay, now the point that we see here, this black point we see in the upper left-hand corner, is called the origin, and that's kind of like the, I guess, the starting reference point for the locations on our screen. Okay. Now, as you move, like we said, as you move to the right, you're changing the x value, and as you move to the right, the x of the origin, the x value gets bigger. So we see this black spot here starts at 0 for x. Then if you move one square over, that's 1 for x, and then 2 for x, and so on. There's a similar situation with the y-axis. So as you move further down from the axis, you increase the y value. Okay? So this coordinate system is how we represent points positions on the screen, and our origin here, the point for this origin is a coordinate pair called 0 0. Okay, so x comes first and then y. Now I will definitely recommend that you go back and read this link here. I'll put the link in the notes and comments, so make sure you take a look at that if you're not familiar with coordinate systems. All right, so now that we've discussed that, we can actually start talking about drawing the sprites on the screen. Okay, so what is a sprite, first of all? So a sprite is a 2D image that's used in computer graphics. All right, so when we're talking about 3D games, those aren't called sprites. Those images are called something else. But for 2D, we call them sprites. So let's create our player image or our player sprite. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create something called variables. So variables are named reusable spaces in the computer's memory that store information or data values. So I'm going to create, when I create my sprite, there's a couple of pieces of information that I want. So the first thing I'm going to store is the player's X position on the screen, the player's Y position, and also the image, the information of the data for the sprite or image itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the player's X position. So if I want to create a variable, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go, I'm going to make some space at the top of my code, and I'm put this new line outside of any of the function bodies. Okay, now I'm going to write the word var. So var lets my program know that I'm about to create a variable. Okay. Then what I have to do is I have to come up with a name for my variable. So I want to store the player's X position. So I'm going to call this variable player X. Okay. And notice my capitalization. Now, if I know where I want the player's X value to be, so maybe I already know the position that I want to store the player at, what I can do is I can set this variable equal to a value. So I can give it a value to store. So I can use the equal sign to do that. Okay, and I'm going to put it at the player X at 10. All right, so that's going to be the player's X coordinate. So, if we're looking back at this coordinate example here, it would be a little bit, this graph only goes up to 6 for the x, but you could imagine that it would be about 4 spaces to the right of this 6 here. Okay, so that's our player x. Now let's store our player y. So I'm going to make the player's y position also at 10. Okay, so 10 pixels to the right of the top left-hand corner of this screen, and then 10 pixels down for the Y. All right. So then the next thing we said we wanted to store was data about the sprite, the image itself. Okay. So I'm going to create another variable called var player sprite. Okay. Now there's a little bit of work that I have to do before I can actually store the information for the image that we want to use. So for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to create or declare this variable name and not actually set it equal to anything. So instead of doing an equal sign, I'm just going to put this semicolon here. So I'm saying that, okay, I'm creating a variable called player sprite. I'm not giving it a value yet, but I'm going to assign it at a later time. Okay. Now, one other thing I'm going to show you, something that's really helpful for when you're writing and reading code, is something called a comment. All right. So a comment starts with 2 forward slashes, and it's basically a line in the code that the computer doesn't pay any attention to. It's more of information for any human that's reading the program so they get an idea of what's happening there. So I'm going to put a comment here that says, let's create our player sprite variables. Okay. So now when anybody's reading this, they'll know that this part of the code is where we're going to create our player sprite variables. All right, we've seen how to create variables now. Now, the next thing we said we wanted to do is we wanted to put some sort of data into that player sprite variable. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to move into our setup function. Okay, so I'm going to put my mouse inside of the curly braces for the setup function, and I'm actually going to put a new line after create canvas. All right, so in order to store the player sprite information, we're going to use another function called load image. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's see how to do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to set my player sprite equal to something. So I'm going to write player sprite equals, okay, and I've already declared the player sprite on this line 4 here. You can see the line numbers here. So on line 4, I created my player sprite. I declared it using the var keyword. Now, if I want to use the variable again later in the program, either to use the value for something or to store something in the variable, I don't have to write var again. All I have to do is just write the variable name and then change it or use the value for something. Okay, so I'm going to set player sprite equal to the result of another function. Okay, and that is the load image function, which is built into another function that's built into P5.js. All right. Now the load image function, we are actually going to give this an argument. We're going to pass it an argument or a parameter, and what we're going to pass in is the link to an online image that we want to use for our player sprite. Okay, and what it's going to do is it's going to go to that link. It's going to get the image data and it's going to store it in our player sprite variable so that later on we can draw it. All right. So I'm going to go ahead. I have a link that I'm going to use, and you will be able to see this in the comments and the notes. So let me go ahead and I'm going to copy this. There's a link that I'm going to copy and paste here. All right. It's kind of a long link, and it's okay. It ended up going onto another line, but that's all right. It's all the same line. You see it's still line 8 here. And the important thing is that you want to notice that the image link is in between quotation marks. Okay, so you gotta make sure that when you pass the image, it's in between the image link. It's in between the quotation marks. Okay, so now we are saying player sprite is equal to. We're going to set it equal to this image data at this link. All right. Now you'll notice if I run it, I still don't have anything drawn on the screen yet, and that's okay because we still have to do another step before we actually see the image drawn out on the screen. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my draw function. Okay. Now I'm going to put something in my draw function. We said that draw is called continuously throughout the program. So draw is a really good place to put code where we want to actually draw images on the screen or update our game or do things like that. So the setup function is a good place to load images or basically set up the images that we want to use in our program. And the draw function is a good place to actually draw the images. All right. Now, in order to draw, what I need to do is I need to use the image function. Now, this is another built-in function that P5.js provides for us. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write this image here, and I've got my parentheses and my semicolon at the end. Now, image, we also need to pass arguments to this function as well. Now, there's 5 arguments that we're going to pass. The first one is going to be the name of the variable that's storing our image data, all right? And that's the one we just saw, player sprite variable, okay? Now, I'm going to have another argument. So I'm going to, again, as we've seen with multiple arguments, you want to separate them by comma. So the player sprite argument was the first one. The second one is going to be the player's x coordinate on the screen. Okay, so that is stored in player x. Okay, now we want to put the player's y position. player Y. So we stored both of those positions in variables, the X and the Y. Now we want to put out how we want to say how wide the image is going to be, because sometimes we might have a picture that's really big, but we might not want it. We might want to shrink it down a little bit so it fits on our screen, or sometimes you might have a small image that you might want to make a bit bigger. So we're going to say that we're going to make the image to be 50 pixels wide and then 50 pixels tall, or so the width and the height are the last two arguments. All right. So now you notice that we have 5 arguments that we've passed to the image function, all separated by commas. Now you don't need a comma after the last argument. All right. And like we said, the arguments need to be in this order. So you don't want to put like the coordinates or the width and the height first. You want to keep it in this order: the image data, the X and the Y positions, and the width and the height. Now, if we press play, we see that our sprite draws out to the screen. Okay, and we can go back to our discussion about the coordinate systems. We see that if we make X bigger, like if we made X 20, it would move it a little bit further over to the right. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's make it 200. So you see, if when X is bigger, it moves further to the right. And if we made Y to be 100, it would move it further down. Okay. So and it's all in reference to this origin, the upper left-hand corner of our play area. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and put these player X and player Y back to what we originally said they were going to be. So that's 10 and 10. Okay, good. So now we know how to draw a sprite out to the screen. Now we saw that the ultimate end goal of this game is to have a player that we can move and that touches a treasure object, a treasure sprite. So knowing now how to create the player sprite, we can do the same basic steps to draw the treasure sprite. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to go back up and create my variables again. So I'm going to again make sure it's outside of any other function. So I'm going to put a comment here. Let's create our treasure sprite variables. Okay. Now I'm going to do var maybe treasure x, and I'm going to set that equal to maybe 300. Okay. I'm going to do var treasure y equals 300. And then I'm going to go ahead and do my treasure sprite variable, var treasure sprite. I'm going to go into my setup function. I'm going to create a new line. I'm going to do load image. And I've got a link for the treasure sprite. Okay, so I've stored my image data now. And then I'm going to go into draw, and I'm going to draw a treasure sprite with the image function. Got to make sure I spell everything right because spelling counts. Treasure sprite, treasure X, treasure Y, and 50 and 50. And if I press play, oops, okay, so looks like I might have made a quick mistake here. So let's see. Okay, so I forgot to do treasure sprite. equals load image. All right, so what's really helpful here about this console down here at the bottom is that if you have an error, then it will give you a nice little error message, and it will, at the end there is a line number. So if you ever make a mistake, then you can look at the line number, and it said it about line 20. So it said there was a problem with line 20, and it was saying that, so we can see that there was a problem with my image call somehow. All right, and actually there is a little bit, it says that I had an empty variable. It says the P5 image was looking for the first parameter, but it received an empty variable instead. So that lets me know that, oh, okay, treasure sprite is the first parameter, and it's empty because I forgot to actually assign a treasure sprite a value. All right, so I had created the treasure sprite variable, I hadn't done the equals, and so then I didn't have anything inside of my treasure sprite variable. So a quick tip for what we call debugging. If you have errors, make sure to look in your console, okay? Now, if I fix that, then that gives me my images. Both my images are on the screen, okay? Great, so we have completed our first step. Check in the notes and comments that go with this lesson for the links that you want to use for the images, and for you can always go back and make sure to look at this code and compare it with yours to make sure you don't have any mistakes.